Hi guys. Tonight we step quietly into the frosted silence of a medieval woodland. Snow muffles the crunch of your boots, but every breath steams in the cold night air, and the shadows of trees loom taller with each step. This is no cozy hearthside story. You are walking into the wilderness where men once risked life and limb to feed their households or impress their lords. The hunt itself was dangerous, but what came after the chase was often worse. The long, frozen hours when night fell, and survival meant more than catching a deer. You're about to discover what it meant to try and rest when the cold itself was your most relentless predator. You probably won't survive this if you try it now, but medieval hunters somehow managed, night after night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time in the comments. I'd love to know where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, and let's sink deeper into the forest together. You trudge further in, noticing how still everything feels under the blanket of snow. The silence is not peaceful, it's heavy, almost pressing down on your chest. A raven flaps overhead, and you're reminded that in medieval Europe, the raven was a bird of omens, seen both as wise and as a herald of death. Hunters who stepped into this hush knew one thing clearly. If they failed to secure fire and shelter, they could freeze to death before dawn. History records that exposure was one of the most common killers for those who lived close to the land. Chroniclers note peasants lost during winter hunts, bodies found in spring thaw curled under trees, cloaks stiff as bark. You realize that hunger wasn't the only threat out here. A medieval man could go days without food, but a single night without warmth could end him. That's the blunt truth of sleeping rough in these frozen woods. Your cloak is wrapped around your shoulders, but the cold seeps through the weave. Wool held heat better than linen, yet once it grew wet with snow, it clung to your skin like ice. And unlike modern waterproof fabrics, there was no magical barrier. You could shake it out, you could beat it with your hand, but if the night was damp, the cold got in anyway. This is why fur trims and hides were so prized. They were more than fashion, they were lifelines. One quirky detail? Medieval manuals of hunting sometimes recommended that if you had to rest, you should lie with your back against the trunk of a great oak or beech, because trees were thought to carry the earth's warmth. Was it true? Well, anyone who has pressed against bark in winter knows it isn't exactly cozy, but in comparison to lying flat on icy ground, it may have felt like some strange comfort. Historians still argue whether this was genuine knowledge passed down by experience or more of a superstition wrapped in practical advice. The air grows sharper as you inhale. You picture a group of hunters pausing after chasing a boar, breath ragged, sweat freezing on their tunics. The sun dips, and they must decide. Do they march back miles to a village or bed down where they stand? The choice often depended on distance, weather, and game. If they'd killed, they might need to guard the carcass until morning to keep wolves away. That meant staying right here, where the body lay, no matter how the frost bit at their toes. Imagine lying down, cloak wrapped, the stars like shards of glass above you. Every creak of the forest is louder in the dark. A snapping twig could mean a fellow hunter turning over, or it could mean wolves circling in. Even the nobles' hunting hounds, trained and trusted, grow restless. Their low growls tell you that not all threats come from the cold. Yet without sleep you cannot hunt again at dawn. Your limbs grow sluggish, your aim falters, and mistakes are fatal in the forest. So, how did they do it? They practiced endurance. Fatigue was both their enemy and their ally. After days of marching, tracking, and hauling game, exhaustion sometimes pulled them into sleep no matter the temperature. Their bodies adapted in ways yours probably wouldn't. Years of hardship bred a kind of resilience modern comfort has dulled. Still, when you shift in your imagined cloak, you know one fact is certain. These hunters survived not because the wilderness was gentle, but because they learned tricks, passed them on, and whispered them to sons before the next winter came. The silence thickens, and with it comes that curious edge of fear. yet also admiration. You sense how fragile life was here, and how ingenious those men had to be just to see the morning frost sparkle once more. You pull the cloak tighter, but no matter how much fabric you gather, the air still nips at your skin. It is in this moment that you realize what every medieval hunter knew all too well. Cold was often a more immediate danger than wolves or wild boar. One beast you could outwit, outrun, or spear, but the night itself? That enemy was patient. It crept into your bones quietly, and if you weren't prepared, you might not wake to see the morning Sunday. The chronicles of medieval Europe are filled with harsh reminders of this truth. Soldiers and hunters alike were recorded as succumbing to exposure in campaigns and winter expeditions. The Bayeux Tapestry even depicts scenes of men cooking by fires, hinting that warmth and sustenance were as important as swords in the survival of armies. For a lone hunter, the danger multiplied. A simple misstep, an injury, or even being caught too far from the nearest settlement could mean lying down in the snow and never rising again. One fascinating detail? Some medieval legal codes actually recognized the peril of winter hunting and forbade peasants from entering certain royal forests during the coldest months, not just to protect the king's game, but because so many hunters were found dead after venturing too far. Whether these rules were for safety or control is still debated by scholars, but it illustrates how dangerous the practice truly was. The risk wasn't just frostbite, though that term itself was not known then. Hunters understood in their own way what we'd now call hypothermia. Shivering was the body's desperate attempt to generate heat, and when it stopped, that was the most terrifying sign. A hunter might become sluggish, confused, even strangely calm, walking into the trees without realizing he was close to collapse. Medieval people explained this with spirits of the cold lulling men into sleep, ghostly figures or demons who whispered that lying down would bring comfort. Historians still argue whether such tales were metaphors for observed symptoms or simply folklore, but they reveal how deeply people feared the unseen enemy of freezing air. You imagine yourself in the woods, hunger gnawing at your belly but cold gnawing harder. What would you choose? Would you walk through the night, hoping to stumble on a village, or would you scrape together pine branches and pray the wind would die down? Both paths carried their own risks. Moving meant exhaustion, slipping on ice, or breaking an ankle. Staying put meant fighting off sleep as your body cooled. It's easy now to laugh about survival shows and camping trips with modern sleeping bags, but strip all of that away, and you're left with the same question medieval hunters faced. How do you keep warm enough to make it until dawn? Even nobles on grand hunting expeditions had to think of this. While they might have squires or servants to prepare fires and shelters, if a storm swept in quickly, even silk-lined tents could collapse under snow, and rich fabrics offered little against freezing winds. Records tell of noblemen cutting hunts short because frost made their hands too stiff to draw bows, and horses too weak to carry riders. Out here, wealth bent only so far to the will of nature. One odd little fact tucked in medieval writings. People sometimes believed drinking wine before sleeping in the cold kept you warmer. It wasn't entirely wrong. Alcohol gives a false sensation of heat, but in truth, it sped up the loss of body warmth. Hunters who indulged may have found themselves slipping deeper into cold's embrace without knowing. It's a mistake you can almost feel yourself making. A warm flush in your cheeks, a relaxed sigh, and then the creeping stillness that follows. Standing in that imagined forest, you sense the quiet desperation of those who came before. Every crunch of snow, every flicker of wind on your neck reminded them of the thin line between survival and silence. And as you shiver, cloak drawn close, you can almost hear the low murmur of hunters warning each other to stay awake, to keep moving, to fight the cold just a little longer, because morning, with its thin but life-saving light, was always worth enduring for. Your fingers are stiff now, and you rub them together, imagining what it must have felt like for a medieval hunter who lacked our insulated gloves and synthetic fabrics. Instead, survival depended on what you wore and how well you layered it. Clothing wasn't just about modesty or appearance in the wilderness, it was a barrier between life and frost. You can almost feel the scratchy weight of wool against your skin, the damp smell of fur hides, and the cold leather that stiffens as the night air deepens. Wool was the most common defense, coarse and heavy. It had a gift. Even when damp, it could hold in some heat. That's why cloaks and tunics of wool were so vital. Hunters wrapped themselves in thick layers, sometimes several tunics one over another, sleeves bunching until their arms looked bulky. Linen shirts beneath helped wick some moisture away, though in winter hunts, sweat often froze as quickly as it formed. You tug at your imagined cloak, feeling how it drapes down to your boots, offering shelter from snowflakes that drift onto your shoulders. Fur was the true treasure. Fox pelts, rabbit skins, or the prized softness of squirrel fur were sewn into linings. Nobles hunted not just for meat but for these furs, which would later circle their collars or line their boots. And yet, in the wilderness, fur was more than fashion. It was a second skin. Even the rougher hunters, peasants chasing deer for survival, valued a rabbit skin cap above most tools. It kept heat from fleeing through the top of the head, something medieval people understood instinctively, long before science explained it. Here's a quirky fact. Some medieval huntsmen wore garments made from sheep or goat hides with the wool still on, effectively turning themselves into walking blankets. To modern eyes, it might look absurd, but imagine bedding down in snow and having your very clothes double as mattress and quilt. Historians still argue whether these outfits were primarily for warmth or whether they also carried symbolic weight, marking a man as closer to beast in the eyes of those who saw him. The line between practicality and ritual dress often blurs in accounts of medieval life. Boots mattered too. Stiff leather could protect, but it also froze solid if soaked. Hunters stuffed straw or moss into their footwear for insulation, a trick that actually worked surprisingly well. You can almost feel the crunch of dry moss beneath your toes, a faint earthy smell rising each time you step. If it froze, you simply replaced it with fresh stuffing the next day. Simple, clever, and effective. Layering didn't stop at clothing. Hunters often carried extra strips of cloth, sometimes old linen rags, which could be wrapped around limbs at night. Tied with twine, they became makeshift gaiters or arm warmers. Picture yourself winding cloth around your legs, pulling it snug until it keeps the air out. No modern thermal socks, no Gore-Tex, just scraps of fabric used with ingenuity. Still, all these layers were heavy. When wet, wool dragged on your shoulders like stone. Cloaks became burdensome, and if you tripped, they could entangle your legs. That's why some hunters cut slits into their cloaks, turning them into versatile poncho-like wraps. They could pull one corner over their heads as a hood, another across their chest as a blanket, and still leave arms free to reach for weapons. Clothing was tool as much as cover. And yet, for all the layering, you know the truth. Even the best, prepared hunter sometimes shivered through the night. Their clothes could only hold back so much. When icy wind tore through the trees, no fur was thick enough, no wool coarse enough, to erase the sting. You shift under your imagined layers, realizing how thin the barrier really is between you and the wilderness. It makes you reflect on the resilience of those men and women who braved the cold for survival. They did not complain about the scratch of wool or the stink of unwashed fur. They were simply grateful for anything that let them wake alive at dawn. You settle yourself deeper into that heavy wool cloak, realizing it is not just a garment, but a tool for survival. In the medieval wilderness, cloaks were the hunter's Swiss army knife, though, of course, no one called them that. By day, they shielded against rain, sleet, and snow. By night, they became blankets, tents, and even walls to block the wind. The same rectangle of fabric could be folded, wrapped, or pinned into whatever shape kept a man alive. A good cloak was often made of thick, fulled wool, a process that shrank and tightened the fibers until water beaded on the surface instead of soaking through immediately. The weave smelled faintly of lanolin, the natural oil of sheep, which added some waterproofing. Hunters prized this quality because without it, a single soaking rain could chill you to the bone. You can almost feel the weight of it on your shoulders, damp at the edges, yet still trapping enough heat to make the difference between comfort and danger. At night, the cloak transformed. Hunters would spread it across pine boughs, turning it into a makeshift mattress that lifted them off the icy ground. Then they'd fold the rest over themselves like a blanket, cocooning body heat inside. If more than one cloak was available, one could serve as a roof, stretched between branches or poles. You can imagine tying it carefully with strips of leather or rope, a tiny lean-to in the middle of endless snow. It wasn't much, but in the bitter night, even a barrier against wind felt like a palace. One curious practice shows how adaptable these cloaks were. Some hunters deliberately carried oversized ones, big enough to wrap entirely around themselves and even their hounds. In illuminated manuscripts, you sometimes see hunters drawn as great bundles of fabric, almost comic in their proportions. Yet those folds meant warmth. Historians still debate whether medieval tailors designed cloaks with sleeping in mind, or if hunters simply learned to make do with garments meant for walking by day. The hood was another gift. A wide, deep hood could be pulled low, shielding the face from snow. But it also became an emergency pillow. Stuffed with moss or straw, the hood lifted the head, keeping hunters from lying flat in damp earth. You picture tucking your cheek into that scratchy nest, hearing the rustle of dried grass as you drift towards sleep. Another quirky tidbit? Some medieval people believed sleeping under a cloak dyed red gave extra warmth because the color itself was thought to carry heat. Was it true? Not scientifically, of course. But in a world where symbolism and superstition often mingled with daily life, the belief that crimson wool was hotter than plain grey may have brought a kind of psychological comfort. Scholars still argue whether such practices were genuine traditions or later romantic embellishments added by storytellers. The cloak's versatility even extended to protection from animals. If wolves circled in the night, a hunter might throw his cloak over the carcass of his kill, masking its smell and buying time. Some claimed a cloak could also trick an animal by making its wearer look larger. Whether or not that worked, you can imagine the desperate creativity of men who had little more than fabric between themselves and teeth in the dark. And so, the cloak wasn't merely clothing. It was shield, tent, blanket, mattress, and even a kind of silent companion. You shift yours again in this imagined forest, realizing how often your life would hang by the threads of woven wool. Without it, the cold would settle on your bones quickly, mercilessly, like frost creeping over glass. With it, you might just close your eyes for a few hours and wake to find the world still turning, snow still falling, and the hunt still waiting. You hear the first crackle of kindling as a hunter kneels in the snow, coaxing a flame to life. The fire is more than warmth. It is reassurance, a flicker of defiance against a world that seems determined to freeze you where you sit. Imagine crouching close, palms outstretched, cheeks glowing red in the rising heat while your back still shivers in the dark. To sleep near fire was both salvation and gamble. If you drifted too close, a spark might land on wool or fur, smouldering quietly until flames licked at your body. Too far, and the cold slid in, numbing your limbs and stealing your breath. It is well established in accounts of medieval hunting parties that fires were central to survival. Soldiers on campaign, hunters in pursuit, even pilgrims on lonely roads, every record stresses the constant tending of flames. Fire was both hearth and guard. You picture men passing the duty around, one shaking the others awake to add branches before the embers faded. If it went out, there was no striking a match. Lighting a fire again in wet conditions could take hours of flint, tinder, and prayer. Better to keep it alive, however small. There was also a peculiar custom whispered in folk memory. Some hunters claimed that sleeping with their heads toward the fire and feet away kept spirits of the night at bay. The reasoning is lost to us, though perhaps it was simply common sense. Face the warmth where your senses were sharpest, feet pushed into the darkness where the cold nipped. Others believed the crackling itself frightened away wolves, as though the forest respected the language of flame. Whether true or not, the notion clings to old tales, a blend of superstition and habit. Yet disagreements remain among medieval historians about how close hunters dared to lie. Some argue they placed bedding directly beside the flames, layering boughs thick to shield sparks. Others insist they kept distance, relying instead on stones heated in the fire to warm their cloaks. Archaeological finds of scorched soil circles in known hunting grounds lend weight to both views, though interpretation shifts depending on who you ask. The evidence flickers, like the embers themselves, never steady. Still, you lean toward the blaze, hearing it pop and sigh. Sparks dance upward, briefly painting the snow orange before vanishing. There is comfort in that sound. It fills the silence that otherwise swallows you whole. Without fire, every twig crack would feel like a predator, every gust like a whisper from the unseen. With it, the night becomes smaller, bounded by a trembling circle of light. But there are hazards. The smoke clings to your cloak, eyes water as sparks sting. Inhaling too much in a crude lean-to might mean a fit of coughing that wakes the hounds. Hunters learned to angle shelters, so smoke streamed away, though wind made a mockery of such plans. Even so, the risks were accepted. To sleep with eyes stinging and throat raw was better than to freeze stiff before dawn. One lesser-known trick involved burying embers beneath a shallow layer of ash and then lying over the ground nearby. The earth itself grew warm, releasing heat slowly through the night. You can imagine scraping away snow, laying pine needles down, and creating a bed warmed from beneath. Primitive, yes, but effective. Modern campers might recognize it as an ancestor to the heated rock beds still taught in survival courses. And then there was the practice of using the fire as a clock. A hunter might note how long it took a log to burn and set that as a measure for watches. When the flames reached a certain mark, it was time to wake the next man, or to stir and throw on new fuel. In this way, the fire not only kept bodies alive, but structured the night, breaking its endless cold hours into manageable fragments. The scent of smoke lingers in your hair, in your cloak, in your skin. To medieval people, it was not unpleasant. It was the smell of safety. Wolves rarely approached too near, and men who wandered could find their companions again by following the drift of smoke on the breeze. More than once, smoke must have saved lives, guiding lost hunters back to warmth. Still, as you curl beside the glow, you sense how precarious it all island. A sudden storm could smother the flames in seconds. Wet wood could sputter and refuse to catch. A shift of wind might send sparks into dry straw bedding. Fire was no guarantee it was a fragile ally. And yet, without it, the long night was unthinkable. You ease yourself down, one hand stretched toward the embers. They crackle like distant applause, celebrating your stubborn will to survive. In the hush between sparks, you realize how thin the line is between life and loss here. Fire is both friend and danger, but it is the only companion that will not abandon you before dawn. You stir in the middle of that imagined night, the fire still glowing faintly, and notice a curious sight. A hunter squatting beside a clay pot, stirring what looks like ash. At first you think he's tending the fire, but no, he's preparing to carry fire itself with him. Medieval ingenuity didn't end at making flames, it extended to transporting them. In a world without matches, the ability to preserve a spark was as precious as meat. Chroniclers of the period describe hunters and wayfarers carrying embers in small earthen vessels or even in hollowed horns. The trick was simple. Pack the coals in ash so they smouldered slowly without burning out. Hours later, when a new fire was needed, they could blow gently, coaxing life back into the embers. You can almost hear the soft breath, the whisper of smoke rising again, and then the sudden flare of orange as fire returns. There was also a strange habit noted in folk tradition. Some travelers sprinkled dried dung over embers before sealing them in a pot. It sounds unpleasant, but it worked. The dung smothered the flame just enough to keep it glowing, and when stirred later, the heat re-emerged. To the modern ear, it feels eccentric, but for men in frozen forests, it was brilliance born of necessity. Experts remain divided on how widespread this practice truly was. Some suggest it was common among nomadic herders who had easy access to dung as fuel, while others argue it was a rare trick remembered in oral tradition rather than everyday life. Archaeological evidence is scarce. Clay pots don't always survive, and the faint traces of ash inside could be from cooking just as easily as from ember transport. The debate still warms the pages of medieval studies, much as the coals once warmed hands in the dark. Picture yourself stumbling after a long day's hunt, snow drifting into your boots, too tired to strike sparks from flint. Instead, you open that pot, stir the coals, and within minutes have a blaze dancing high. You saved yourself hours of work and maybe even your life. You realize why such a small vessel could be carried with as much care as a bow or blade. One curious report from northern Europe even claims hunters tied glowing embers inside iron boxes strapped to their belts. These acted like primitive hand warmers, radiating just enough heat to thaw stiff fingers. Whether this was widespread practice or imaginative exaggeration, it reveals how desperately people sought to tame cold. You can almost feel the warmth seeping through your side, subtle but comforting, like a heartbeat against your hip. The method was not without risk. Embers sometimes flared unexpectedly, cracking pots or even scorching cloaks. Smoke could draw unwanted attention if carried too openly, betraying hunters to rivals or to animals. Imagine trudging through a silent forest and seeing a thin ribbon of smoke curling from someone's satchel. You would know instantly they carried fire with them, a treasure and a vulnerability. Carrying fire also had a social meaning. It tied hunters to their companions. If one group lost its flame, they might travel miles to borrow embers from another. The gesture was more than practical. It was a sign of trust and solidarity. In some villages, giving a neighbor coals at dawn was considered a blessing for the day ahead. These little acts remind you how something as simple as heat bound communities together. As you cradle the pot in your mind's eye, you realize how fragile medieval survival was. Fire wasn't a given. It was a prize wrestled daily from wood, stone, and breath. To sleep in the wilderness without it meant counting heartbeats until cold claimed you. To carry it was to carry life itself, glowing softly in a clay womb. And so, as you roll onto your side, listening to the faint hiss of smouldering embers, you understand why hunters guarded these tiny sparks more fiercely than treasure. The ground beneath you is hard, unyielding, and colder than the air itself. Any hunter lying directly on frozen earth would soon discover a cruel truth. The body loses heat faster into the ground than into the air. So, medieval hunters learned to build bedding not of cloth or feather, but of forest itself. They turned to evergreen boughs, pine needles, and whatever soft greenery could be stripped from branches to create insulation. You kneel now in that imagined snow, snapping fir twigs, their resin sticking to your fingers, the smell sharp and almost medicinal in your nose. Accounts from foresters and travelers confirm this practice. Beds of spruce or pine branches were spread thickly, sometimes a foot or more high, so the sleeper never touched bare soil. This was not luxury. It was survival. Even the best cloak failed if the cold ground leached warmth straight from the spine. By layering greenery, hunters created what was essentially a primitive mattress, both cushion and insulation. It rustled when you lay down, crackling softly like distant applause, but it kept you alive. One unusual trick, remembered in Scandinavian tradition, was to lay fresh branches with the cut ends outward, then cover them with moss or leaves. This pattern supposedly reduced drafts sneaking up through the bedding. Whether it truly worked or simply felt better, no one can say for certain. But you can imagine arranging branches with care, building not just a bed, but a barrier against the creeping fingers of frost. Modern scholars disagree about how widespread such methods were. Some argue every hunter knew them instinctively, while others believe they were regional habits, passed down by woodmen in colder climates. Archaeological sites rarely preserve piles of needles or moss, so the evidence comes mostly from descriptions and folklore. What's clear, though, is that bedding mattered, and those who neglected it often paid with their lives. The sensory details of such beds come to life as you imagine lying on one. The needles prick slightly through your cloak, not unpleasantly but reminding you of their presence. The scent of resin fills your nose, mingling with smoke from the nearby fire. As you exhale, your breath forms little clouds that hang above you, then drift away into the night. Beneath you, instead of biting cold, there is only a faint coolness, dulled by the thick layer of green. Hunters also learned that bedding could be reused. After a night, branches grew brittle, needles dropped, but the layer of moss or straw underneath might hold for several days. Groups often camped in the same spot for extended hunts, repairing their makeshift beds daily like weary housekeepers in a woodland inn. You imagine the morning routine. Shake out your cloak, toss aside the blackened branches, lay down new ones, and prepare for another night of uneasy sleep. One odd little belief clings to these makeshift beds. Some people thought spruce and pine boughs had protective powers, warding off evil spirits of the woods. Sleeping on such greenery wasn't only about comfort, it was about safety from forces unseen. Whether hunters believed this or repeated it half-jokingly around the fire, it reveals how deeply they entwined the natural world with their imagination. You can almost smile at the thought of a man muttering, "The needles keep the cold demons away," before rolling over to snore. As you nestle into that imagined bed of pine, you realize how much of survival was about adaptation. These men and women had no down-filled sleeping bags, no insulated mats, no easy comfort. Instead, they took what the forest offered: branches, moss, bark, hides, fire. They layered them carefully, and in doing so, they crafted a barrier between life and death, green and white, warmth and frost. And now, with the resinous smell in your nose and the faint prickle beneath your back, you close your eyes, knowing you might wake up when the pale sun rises. You shift slightly, pulling your cloak tighter, and feel the rough weight of something heavier draped over you. This time it is not just woven wool, but the thick hide of an animal still smelling faintly of musk, still carrying the memory of the beast it once belonged to. Medieval hunters depended on hides not only as trophies but as insulation. Sleeping beneath the skin of a bear, a wolf, or even a deer was often the surest way to keep death from the cold at bay. Accounts from the period describe hunters carefully preserving skins after the kill, not only for trade or display but for immediate use. A stag's hide might be laid hair-side down to trap warmth, while wolf pelts, dense and bristling, were prized for their ability to keep frost from creeping in. The use of animal skins is well documented in medieval inventories, where nobles stored piles of furs for both clothing and bedding. But in the forest, far from the manor, those same hides became blankets against the night. One lesser-known practice appears in northern folk tradition. Hunters sometimes warmed themselves by wrapping fresh hides around their bodies before they fully dried. The warmth of the animal's lingering body heat bought precious time before the chill set in. To our modern sensibilities it feels unsettling, but in that frozen wilderness, survival often overruled comfort. The steaming pelt might stink, might stick, but it kept a man breathing through the night. There remains disagreement among experts about just how common this was. Some suggest it was a desperate measure reserved for emergencies, while others argue it was a practical and accepted trick, especially among poorer hunters without spare furs to carry. The evidence lies mostly in oral tales and later writings, leaving room for interpretation. Still, the image is haunting, wrapping yourself in the very creature you had slain, taking its warmth as your own. Hides were not always soft. Bear skins, while luxuriously thick, were also coarse, their stiff guard hairs scratching at the skin. Deer hides, once dried, could feel rigid until worked supple. That is why hunters often layered hides over beds of pine boughs, combining cushioning and insulation. You can almost feel the heaviness pressing down, pinning you to the earth. a weight both protective and suffocating. And yet, that weight could save you. Furs and hides created air pockets, trapping body heat the way modern down works. Even the poorest peasant might value a single rabbit skin as the difference between shivering and sleeping. In many regions, hides were stitched together crudely, creating patchwork coverings. These were not elegant garments, they were survival quilts, pieced from whatever the forest gave. There was also symbolic meaning in sleeping beneath hides. To cover oneself with the skin of a wolf was to borrow its strength, to believe, even if only half seriously, that its spirit might guard you through the night. Some hunters whispered that the animals would not haunt those who honored their remains in this way. Was it belief, or simply a comforting story told in the dark? No one can say for certain, but it lingers in the lore like the scent of fir smoke dried by a campfire. Imagine yourself beneath such a hide now. The smell is strong, musky, not entirely pleasant, yet there is warmth radiating back into you. Each breath of steam rises into the night, and frost gathers on the tips of hairs above your face. The world outside remains bitter and hostile, but beneath this living relic of the hunt, there is a cocoon, a fragile but real refuge. It reminds you that survival in the medieval forest was a constant negotiation between hunter and hunted, between cold and warmth, between fear and sleep. Tonight, you lie within that balance, shielded by the very creatures whose paths you once stalked. The irony is sharp, but the comfort undeniable. The fire burns low, your cloak and hide drawn close, yet the cold still seeps in. It is then that you realize what many medieval hunters relied upon most, not just fabric or fur, but one another. Human bodies generate heat, and in the frozen silence of the forest, shared warmth was the difference between misery and death. You shift in your mind's eye, pressing shoulder to shoulder with companions, breath mingling in the dark, the sound of tired sighs blending with the crackle of embers. Contemporary records mention hunters traveling in groups not only for protection against beasts but for comfort through the night. Sleeping pressed together was neither shameful nor strange, it was expected. The annals of certain hunting lodges describe men lying like hounds in the den, a vivid image of bodies curled close in communal defense against frost. Even noble parties, though accompanied by tents and attendants, sometimes had to huddle when storms collapsed their shelters. Warmth was democratic in the forest. There is also an odd practice remembered in alpine folk tradition. Hunters arranged themselves in alternating directions, head to feet, so that each man's body heat radiated across another's chest or legs. The formation looked peculiar, but it maximized warmth across the group. Whether this was universally common or just regional is uncertain, but the image is striking. Grown men sprawled in strange patterns, practicality outweighing dignity. Scholars remain divided about whether such sleeping arrangements carried ritual meaning or were purely pragmatic. Some argue that medieval brotherhoods of hunters ritualized closeness, seeing it as a bond of loyalty. Others insist it was simply what exhaustion demanded. No one cared about symbolism when snow was piling over cloaks. The truth may rest somewhere in between. Picture yourself now in that circle of men, cloaks overlapping, one man's arm half across your shoulder, another's knee nudging into your side. It is not comfortable in the modern sense. There is snoring, the smell of sweat and smoke, the constant shifting, but it is safe. Warmth builds within the cluster, radiating outward until even the night's cruel bite dulls. The sound of breathing becomes rhythm, steady and reassuring, a chorus of survival. Even the animals noticed. Hunting dogs often curled at the edges of these human knots, drawn by heat and loyalty. Their bodies formed outer rings, further blocking drafts. In many ways, hunters and hounds became one pack, guarding each other through the long dark. Imagine the soft weight of a dog pressing against your legs, its warmth seeping into you, its steady breath lulling you toward uneasy rest. Yet this closeness was not without hazards. Lice and fleas thrived in such conditions, passing easily from man to man. Accounts of hunting camps often note the itching torments of nights spent shoulder to shoulder. But when the alternative was freezing alone, men accepted these irritations. Survival, once again, outweighed comfort. There is something profoundly human in this. Around the fire, beneath cloaks and hides, pressed against one another, medieval hunters recreated the warmth of the hearth they lacked. They were not merely enduring the forest, they were forming a temporary home in its heart. The intimacy of shared survival bred trust, perhaps even affection, as men learned to depend on each other not just for protection in the hunt, but for the very act of waking alive at dawn. So, as you imagine yourself drifting off, cocooned within a huddle of weary companions, you understand. In the medieval wilderness, warmth was not just physical, it was communal, carried in breath, in body, in the quiet acknowledgement that no one survived the cold alone. The night deepens, and just when you think the cold will creep back in, you feel a sudden nudge, wet, warm, and alive. It's a hound, curling against your side, pressing its body close to yours as though it knows you need each other. Medieval hunters rarely slept without their dogs. These animals were not just tools for the chase, but trusted companions in the long, frozen hours. Their warmth was as valuable as their noses, and sometimes more. Descriptions of hunting parties in noble households often highlight the role of dogs. They were pampered in ways peasants could scarcely imagine, fed scraps of venison, given collars of leather and even bronze. But once in the wild, all status dissolved. A hunter and his hound lay together in the snow, sharing body heat to fend off the chill. You picture rough hands ruffling a shaggy coat, then both man and beast settling down, breath steaming in the moonlight. A curious little note appears in a 14th century text from France. Some hunters swore that sleeping with a greyhound by your chest was warmer than 3 cloaks combined. Perhaps it was exaggeration, perhaps not. Anyone who has ever felt the steady warmth of a dog pressed against their ribs knows how believable it sounds. The companionship soothed fear as well. A bark in the dark warned of wolves, and a growl could jolt a man awake before danger arrived. Modern historians debate just how central dogs were to peasant hunts. Nobles documented their prized packs in detail, but poor men often relied on mongrels of mixed breed. Some argue these village curs were just as vital in the cold, curling at their masters' feet like living boots. Others suggest peasants, stretched thin by hunger, could not always afford to feed animals through winter, leaving them to fend without canine warmth. The evidence is uneven, drawn from patchwork records and folk memory. Still, the sensory image is vivid: coarse fur under your fingertips, a wet nose nudging into your palm, the faint rhythm of a tail thumping against pine needles. Dogs gave reassurance no cloak or fire could match. They were living, breathing allies against the night. Even the smell, earthy, musky, sometimes damp, became part of the fabric of survival. It meant you were not alone. There is a touching irony in this partnership. By day, man commanded the hound. Track the deer, flush the boar, hold the quarry. By night, roles reversed. The hound became the protector, its warmth saving the master, its sharp senses guarding against unseen threats. You roll slightly, feeling the imagined weight of a head on your thigh, ears twitching at every sound in the darkness. One folk belief held that dogs could sense the presence of wandering spirits in the forest. Hunters told stories of hounds growling at nothing, refusing to lie down in certain spots. Some took it as warning, shifting camp in uneasy haste. Whether superstition or instinct, the dogs shaped where men slept, influencing survival decisions in ways both practical and mystical. And so you lie there, cocooned not only in cloak and hide, not only in the press of fellow hunters, but with a dog curled firmly against you. The heat radiates steadily, the sense of watchfulness even steadier. The night is long, the cold endless, but with that companionship pressed to your side, you find a sliver of comfort. The wilderness feels less vast, less merciless, when shared with the steady heartbeat of a loyal animal. The fire flickers low, the dogs snore gently, and yet a new challenge emerges. The bitter wind slicing between tree trunks, carrying ice on its breath. A cloak and fur may protect you, but without some barrier, drafts creep in and gnaw at every exposed edge. Hunters knew this, and so they built what they could from branches, brush, and snow temporary shelters that rose in a matter of hours and made the difference between survival and frostbite. Written descriptions from medieval forestry guides mention lean-tos assembled against sturdy trees. Branches were stacked at an angle, overlapping like crude shingles, then covered with boughs or even snow itself to block the gale. It was not artistry, it was urgency. Imagine chopping at young saplings with a dull hatchet, your hands numbed, your breath clouding so thick you can barely see, just to pile enough wood to form a wall. Once complete, you crouch inside, fire at the opening, smoke drifting upward through cracks. One unusual method noted in Scandinavian lore involved weaving thin branches into a lattice, then plastering it with mud or clay if the ground was not frozen solid. In winter, this might harden into a rough shield, turning a flimsy frame into a stout barricade against gusts. It was heavy work, but hunters desperate for protection sometimes attempted it. Whether this was common or rare is contested among researchers, since evidence of such fragile shelters seldom survives, leaving debate wide open. To lie in such a lean-to was not comfortable. Snow often melted on the roof, dripping cold beads onto cloaks. Wind hissed through the gaps, rattling branches like bones. Yet it gave a sense of enclosure, a psychological comfort as much as a physical one. To put a wall between yourself and the wilderness, however crude, was to feel a little less like prey in a boundless forest. Hunters also employed what might be called brush huts, piling branches in teepee-like shapes, covering them with moss or evergreen boughs until the inside was just large enough to curl into. These were cramped, dark, and smoky if you tried to light a small fire inside, but they offered warmth trapped in a bubble of your own breath. You can almost taste the stale air, your lungs filling with damp, pine-scented steam, your body thawing despite the discomfort. There was a curious belief recorded in some alpine villages that shelters covered in juniper branches repelled wolves, the sharp scent confusing their noses. Whether the wolves were truly deterred, or the story spread simply to calm, frightened hunters, remains uncertain. Yet the practice lingered, juniper sprigs deliberately placed on roofs like protective charms. What strikes you is the sheer effort poured into these makeshift homes. After hours of hunting, men still found the energy to hack, weave, and pile until something resembling a barrier stood around them. Fatigue could have driven them to simply collapse under a tree, but experience taught them otherwise. Those who worked for an extra hour to build cover often lived. Those who didn't might be found frozen, curled in snowdrifts when spring thaw arrived. Now you duck into your imagined lean-to, the wind muffled, the fire glowing faintly outside. Shadows dance along the walls of branches, and you feel, for the first time that night, almost sheltered. It is still cold, still damp, still uncomfortable, but it is bearable. And in the medieval wilderness, bearable was a luxury worth every drop of sweat. The wind howls above the treetops, rattling your fragile lean-to, but some hunters had an even stranger ally against the cold: the snow itself. To you, it seems madness digging into the very thing that freezes you, but medieval woodsmen in harsher climates knew the paradox well. Snow, when shaped correctly, could insulate better than any cloak, and so they carved caves and dugouts into drifts, turning frost into shelter. Travelers' journals from northern Europe and the Carpathian ranges recount hunters hollowing deep pits, roofing them with branches and piling snow on top until only a small entrance remained. The interior, though icy, trapped body heat and blocked the cutting wind. To lie inside was like curling into the earth's chest, cold walls glistening faintly, yet strangely warmer than the night outside. It's a trick modern Arctic explorers still use. but its roots reach back centuries. One curious practice survives in oral tradition. Hunters sometimes lit a small flame in such caves, believing the snow would harden into ice, sealing cracks and making the shelter sturdier. The science is sound, the heat melts the surface just enough to refreeze, but whether medieval men understood or stumbled into the trick remains debated among researchers. Some suggest it was knowledge carried from northern nomads. Others believe it was rediscovered repeatedly wherever snow ruled the land. Imagine crawling into such a den, your hands scraping cold powder aside, breath filling the tiny chamber with mist. It smells faintly metallic, sharp in your nostrils. You curl on pine boughs laid beneath you, your cloak wrapped tight, and realize that, paradoxically, the air feels still and protective. The blizzard outside howls unheard, muffled by thick white walls. Silence presses in, broken only by your own heartbeat. Yet snow caves had dangers. More than one hunter was said to have suffocated when the entrance collapsed under drifting snow. Others froze when damp seeped into their cloaks. Still, many risked it rather than face an open sky. To a man exhausted from the chase, the thought of lying in a sheltered cocoon outweighed the hazards. An odd little tale survives from alpine folklore. Some believed snow caves were guarded by spirits of the mountain who would grant survival to the respectful but smother the arrogant. Whether metaphor or genuine superstition, it gave meaning to those tense nights beneath glittering ceilings of ice. You shift in your imagination, running a hand along the wall of your shelter. It is smooth, cold, but solid. The air is sharp, but still. And you realize that for medieval hunters, survival often meant surrendering to the very elements they feared. To fight snow was hopeless, but to burrow into it that was cunning. And so you lie back, wrapped in your cloak, trusting the frozen world to hold you gently until morning light filters through the narrow opening. You stir awake to a new kind of shelter, not one carved or built, but found. Sometimes, when exhaustion set in and tools were scarce, medieval hunters slipped into the natural hollows of the forest. Fallen trees, with their trunks rotted hollow, became burrows large enough for a man to crawl inside. Roots of great oaks spread like twisted ribs, leaving cavities beneath them where snow piled above and warmth collected below. These were not comfortable, but they offered refuge when nothing else could be made in time. Accounts from travelers and woodcutters confirm that such hideaways were used in emergencies. One chronicle from the Baltic describes hunters surviving a blizzard by crawling into the belly of a fallen beech, the bark above thick as armor against the storm. When dawn came, they emerged stiff but alive, the tree itself their guardian. These stories linger in local lore as reminders that the forest provided shelter if you knew where to look. There was a peculiar trick noted in rural memory. Hunters sometimes lined these hollows with dry leaves or moss, turning a dank cavity into a nest. The padding kept the damp at bay and made the space warmer than bare wood or soil. You can imagine kneeling inside such a hollow, stuffing moss into cracks. The earthy scent thick, the air close but less cruel than the open night. Specialists remain uncertain how widespread this reliance on natural shelters truly was. Some argue it was common sense practiced across Europe, while others think it was rare, used only by those who knew the woods intimately. Archaeology offers little help. Tree hollows leave no remains once the wood decays. The debate continues, fueled by a handful of scattered references and much speculation. Inside, the sensory experience was mixed. The air was still, muffled by bark. Outside, wind roared. Inside, you heard only the rustle of small creatures nesting nearby. Sometimes, hunters shared their hollow with foxes or badgers already curled within. Folklore tells of men waking nose to nose with startled animals, both parties too cold to fight, choosing truce until morning. Whether literal truth or symbolic tale, the image is vivid. Man and beast huddled by necessity, equals for a night. There was also superstition attached. Some villagers warned against sleeping in tree roots, claiming spirits of the forest lived there and might steal your dreams. Others insisted the opposite, that the roots connected you to the earth's strength, protecting you as long as you entered with respect. Perhaps both were said, depending on who told the story and how desperate the listener was to believe. You crawl into the hollow in your imagination now, the bark rough beneath your palms, the darkness close around you. It smells of rot and soil, faintly sweet and damp. It is not cozy, but it shields you. The world shrinks to a tunnel of wood and earth, and in that narrow shelter, you understand the balance of medieval survival once again. Where tools failed, nature sometimes opened its arms if you were willing to lie close against its ribs. The hollow of a tree may offer safety, but sometimes hunters had no shelter at all. On such nights, when storms pressed too fiercely or when fatigue dragged them down mid-step, they simply leaned against the trunk of a sturdy oak or pine, wrapped in cloak and fur, and tried to sleep upright. It was not rest in any pleasant sense, but a desperate compromise, eyes half closed, spear in hand, body fighting the cold while still alert to danger. Contemporary observers noted this habit in accounts of foresters and night watchmen. They described men dozing like birds upon branches, which may sound poetic, but it reflects a grim truth. Leaning sleep was a survival tactic. To lie down on frozen soil risked losing heat too quickly. To remain upright at least kept blood moving. You imagine yourself pressing your back to bark, knees bent slightly, cloak drawn over your face, the world rocking with every gust of wind. A curious trick, remembered in Germanic folklore, was to wedge a staff or spear between roots and lean the body into it, using it almost like a tripod. This way, a hunter could doze in short bursts without toppling fully into the snow. Was this widespread practice, or just a clever anecdote passed down? The sources remain ambiguous, leaving modern researchers divided. Some argue it was common among solitary woodsmen. Others suggest it was more likely a storyteller's flourish. The sensory picture is harsh. Bark presses into your back, rough and unyielding. Your head lolls forward, snapping up again when cold shocks your face. Your legs cramp, your arms ache, yet you manage fragments of rest between shivers. The forest is alive with noises, branches cracking in the frost. The distant howl of wolves, the shifting groans of trees under ice. You never truly sleep, only hover on the edge of it, body refusing to let go entirely. One odd belief clung to this upright rest. Some hunters claimed that sleeping against certain trees, oak, ash, or elm, brought strength, while others brought weakness. Oak, with its sacred status in much of Europe, was considered a protector, sheltering the sleeper with its spirit. Birch, in contrast, was thought unlucky, its pale bark seen as ghostly. Whether these associations were superstition or simply comforting stories told to make misery bearable, we cannot be sure. There is something strangely stoic about it. Men dozing half awake, spears clutched in stiff fingers, faces hidden in hoods, snow piling silently on shoulders. They were both vulnerable and vigilant, resting without surrender. Even nobles, stripped of tents or caught in sudden storms, might be reduced to this posture, sharing the same suffering as peasants who hunted for survival. As you lean your own back against an imagined trunk, eyes heavy, you understand the bitter reality of such nights. It was not about comfort. It was about endurance, keeping just enough strength to rise again at dawn, to march, to track, to live. In the medieval wilderness, even rest could feel like battle, and every moment of half-sleep won upright against the bark was a victory over the cold. Your back is stiff from leaning against the tree, so you imagine shifting to a new ritual of warmth, one that begins before you even lie down. Medieval hunters, weary from the chase, often fortified themselves with food, drink, and heated stones, creating a buffer of heat inside and out. To them, supper was not simply nourishment, it was armor against the freezing night. Chroniclers of noble hunts describe steaming pots of broth simmering over fires. Venison bones boiled with roots and herbs gave a hot, oily liquid that slid down throats and spread warmth through bellies. Even peasants, with less to spare, might brew thin porridge or ale warmed by the flames. These meals were not luxurious, but they mattered more than flavor. They gave the body fuel to stoke its inner furnace. You can almost taste that broth now, salty and smoky, your breath turning to mist as it leaves your lips. One curious practice noted in monastic writings was the heating of stones in fire, then wrapping them in cloth to place at the feet before sleep. Simple, clever, and effective, like primitive hot water bottles. The warmth seeped into weary limbs, lingering long after the flames died. Imagine sliding your bare feet against that stone, sighing as stiffness ebbs away, the cloth smelling faintly of charred wool. It is such a small luxury, yet in the dark, it feels like a miracle. There is ongoing discussion among researchers about how widespread alcohol was used as a warming aid during hunts. Some sources note men drinking strong ale or mead before bed, believing it fended off cold. Others caution that the effect was deceptive, a flush that sped heat loss. Modern science agrees with the latter, but to a medieval hunter, the comfort of drowsiness may have outweighed any hidden risk. Whether blessing or curse, drink often accompanied nights in the forest. Odd little remedies also surface in folklore. Sprigs of juniper burned in the fire, believed to purify the air and keep lungs strong. Mint leaves chewed before bed to heat the chest. Even garlic cloves tucked into belts as talismans against chill. Whether medicinal, symbolic, or simply habit, these details reveal how hunters blended practical survival with ritual comfort. The sensory world of such preparations was rich, the bubbling of broth in iron pots, the hiss of stones pulled from fire and dropped into snow to cool slightly, the clink of drinking horns as companions passed them around, all combined into a chorus of survival. Even the steam rising from food felt like a protective curtain, wrapping you briefly in warmth. Now you close your eyes, belly full, feet pressed to a warm stone, breath heavy with the sweetness of mead. The cold is still there, crouching at the edges of your shelter, but for a while it feels far away. This too was the secret of medieval hunters, not only to endure but to snatch small comforts in the midst of hardship. A bowl of broth, a glowing stone, a sip of ale, all of them little rebellions against the long night. Your stomach is settled with broth, your feet still warmed by that glowing stone. And yet the forest has a way of reminding you that warmth is not only physical. For medieval hunters, protection often came from words, gestures, and unseen powers. Before sleep, many whispered prayers or charms, believing that faith and superstition guarded them through the night just as surely as cloaks and hides. Manuscripts from the late Middle Ages record short invocations hunters recited before lying down. Some were Christian, calling on Saint Hubert, the patron saint of hunters, for safety. Others were older, fragments of pagan custom lingering in remote villages, murmured rhymes meant to keep frost demons from entering the camp. You can almost hear the low chant in the dark, half prayer, half lullaby, mixing smoke and breath in the stillness. A curious practice described in Alpine oral tradition was the drawing of a cross in ash at the edge of the fire. Hunters traced it quickly with a stick, then scattered the embers slightly, as though marking a boundary between warmth and wilderness. Whether an act of faith or simply habit, it lent a sense of order to the chaos of the forest night. Researchers remain divided on how deeply superstition influenced these routines. Some argue that prayers were sincere, rooted in fear of wolves and frost. Others suggest they were more like rituals of reassurance, small actions that steadied the mind before the long, cold hours. The surviving evidence is patchy, shaped by church writers who sometimes condemned pagan mutterings while praising invocations to saints. What cannot be denied is that hunters carried these words with them as firmly as their knives. You imagine kneeling at the fire's edge, hands pressed together, whispering to the night. The smoke curls upward as though carrying your words into the branches above. The hounds settle when they hear your voice, their ears twitching at the familiar rhythm. For a moment, the forest feels less hostile, as though unseen guardians watch with you. There were also small charms carried as amulets, bits of antler carved with symbols, sprigs of rowan or yew tied into cloaks, even scraps of parchment with psalms written on them. Some hunters believed these kept away evil spirits of the wood. Others wore them because tradition demanded it. Better to carry a charm than tempt fate by leaving it behind. The sensory details here are quiet but powerful. The rasp of whispered words, the soft scratching of a finger drawing shapes in ash, the faint clink of a pendant against wool. These sounds and gestures did not warm the body, but they warmed the spirit, providing courage to close eyes in a place where death lurked in silence. Oddly enough, some tales say prayers kept not only spirits, but cold itself at bay. Hunters joked, or perhaps truly believed, that God rewarded the faithful with warmer nights. Whether taken seriously or not, such thoughts helped them surrender to sleep, convinced they were shielded by more than fur and flame. As you drift now in this imagined night, you whisper a few words yourself, whether to saint, spirit, or simply to the dark. And in that fragile act, you discover what medieval hunters must have known. Survival was not only about fires and cloaks, but also about finding courage in belief. The fire is low, the prayers whispered, but one truth lingers. Sleep was never safe. For a medieval hunter, to lie down in the forest meant surrendering awareness, and danger prowled in every direction. That is why weapons were never set aside. Bow, spear, or knife always rested within reach, tucked against a cloak or even clutched in hand, a last defense should the night bring more than frost. Medieval hunting manuals stress the importance of vigilance, describing men who kept blades beneath their cloaks and bows strung beside them. A spear leaned against the shoulder could serve as both pillow and alarm shift too much, and its wooden shaft reminded you it was there. You picture yourself rolling on the pine boughs, hand brushing cold iron, comforted by its presence. One unusual trick noted in oral tradition was the habit of resting with a knife unsheathed, slipped inside the palm as one dozed. The theory was simple. If startled awake, a hunter could strike instantly. The danger, of course, was cutting oneself in sleep. Whether this was common or merely bravado, recounted in stories, remains uncertain, but it reveals how deeply fear of vulnerability shaped the night. Scholars debate whether nobles followed the same practices as peasants. Some argue that aristocrats, cushioned by servants and tents, relaxed their guard. Others insist that wild boars and wolves cared nothing for rank, and that every man in the forest clung to steel when he closed his eyes. Without clear records, interpretation wavers, leaving only scattered hints from chronicles and illustrations. The sensory details sharpen in your imagination. Your hand closes on a knife hilt, leather cold, metal biting with frost. The bowstring twangs faintly as you shift, its tension never entirely slack. The spear's point glints in firelight, a silent sentinel beside your body. These are not just tools for the hunt, they are lifelines in the dark. And there were other reasons for this habit. Rival hunters roamed the same woods, and disputes over territory or prey sometimes turned violent. To be caught, sleeping without arms, was to invite theft or worse. Weapons kept close ensured not only safety from animals, but from men themselves. The forest was lawless, and survival demanded constant readiness. A curious folk tale from Eastern Europe tells of a hunter who dreamt his spear grew hot in his hand just as a bear crept into camp. He woke to find the beast looming above him, saved only because his weapon was already clutched tight. Whether legend or memory embroidered, it illustrates the deep association between weapons and watchful sleep. Now you imagine yourself drifting into uneasy slumber, fingers curled on iron, ear tuned to every crack in the undergrowth. You do not rest fully, you hover between waking and dream, body taut, mind alert even in exhaustion. It is a fragile kind of sleep, born of necessity, and yet, with your weapons close, you feel the faint reassurance that you are not entirely defenseless, even in the wilderness's darkest hours. The weapon rests in your hand, but your ears stay sharper still. In the medieval forest, hunters slept lightly, half dreaming and half listening, because the night was never silent. Every creak of wood, Every snap of a twig, every cry in the distance might spell danger. To fall too deeply asleep was to risk waking to teeth at your throat or hooves trampling your camp. And so, listening became part of the act of resting. Chroniclers often mention the strange soundscapes of winter woods. Owls hooted low, wolves howled from ridges, and branches groaned as ice bent them. To medieval ears, these were not just noises, they were signs. A distant howl might mean a pack moving closer. A sudden silence could mean predators lurking unseen. You imagine yourself curled on pine boughs, cloak pulled tight, heart quickening at every sound in the dark. One odd custom appears in French folklore. Hunters sometimes placed bells on their dogs at night, small chimes meant to warn of movement. The tinkling was reassurance, a sign the hound was still there and nothing approached too closely. Was it effective, or simply soothing to anxious minds? Modern researchers disagree, since bells could just as easily draw attention, yet the practice lingers in old songs and tales, suggesting it carried at least symbolic weight. Specialists remain divided, too, on whether hunters welcomed the howls of wolves or feared them outright. Some argue the cries were markers, letting men know where packs roamed so they could avoid them. Others insist they were terrifying reminders of being outnumbered, a chorus that frayed nerves and made sleep impossible. Without diaries from the hunters themselves, we cannot know for certain, and so the debate continues. You can almost hear it now, the low rise and fall of howls, echoing through trees, blending with the crackle of dying fire. Your hound lifts its head, ears twitching, growl low but not urgent, yet you cannot relax fully. Even the wind speaks, whistling through branches, carrying flakes that hiss softly as they strike your cloak. It is a soundscape of survival, a constant reminder that the wilderness never sleeps, even if you try to. There is a curious sensory detail described in some old accounts. Men swore they could hear the frost itself forming, tiny crackles as ice spread over bark or across pools of water. Whether truth or imagination, it reveals how heightened their senses became in the silence of the forest. Deprived of light, ears strained for every clue, turning natural phenomena into omens. And so you lie awake, hovering between sleep and alertness. Each sound startles, then soothes, then startles again. You realize that this half-rest was perhaps the only rest many hunters knew. It was not the deep slumber of a feather bed in a manor. It was survival's uneasy truce with exhaustion, punctuated by the voices of the night. You close your eyes once more, letting those sounds wash over you, the owl's call, the hound's sigh, the whisper of branches rubbing together. They are both warning and lullaby, reminders that you are never alone out here. The forest speaks constantly, and if you learn to listen, it just might let you see another dawn. You drift, uneasy, but then a new discomfort grips you, dampness. Few things were as deadly to a medieval hunter as wet clothes in freezing air, and the most treacherous culprit was water crossing a stream by day, only to spend the night shivering from soaked boots and cloaks. Rivers and creeks, beautiful in summer, became silent killers in winter. To step into icy water meant carrying that cold with you into the night. Records from hunting manuals and forest law texts emphasize the danger of rivers during winter hunts. Hunters were warned to avoid fords at dusk, for arriving at camp wet meant hours of misery. Even nobles with attendants and tents found themselves helpless if cloaks were soaked through. You imagine the weight of wet wool now, sagging across your shoulders, clinging to your arms, stiffening as frost locks the threads into icy armor. There was a practical trick noted in Central European tradition. Hunters carried spare strips of linen or old cloth specifically for drying. These were not luxuries but survival tools, pressed against boots, wrapped around calves, changed when damp. The fabric might be crude, but it kept moisture from settling deep into the body. It feels almost like the ancestor of the modern sock change, an act so simple yet so life-preserving. Debate among scholars persists about how much preparation peasants could afford. Some argue that poorer hunters rarely carried spares, relying instead on fire to dry garments overnight. Others believe even the poorest households kept bundles of rags for journeys, knowing too well the dangers of wet feet. Archaeological finds of layered footwear with straw or moss suggest improvisation was common. The sensory detail is vivid. You sit by the fire, boots steaming, the smell of wet leather sharp in your nose. Smoke curls upward as damp cloaks hiss when held too close to flames. Too near, and the fabric scorches. Too far, and it never dries. The process is slow, frustrating, and fraught with risk. More than one hunter must have woken to find a boot half burned, ruined in the attempt to drive out water. An odd little story from Bohemian folklore tells of hunters drying boots on sticks beside a fire, only for wolves to steal them in the night, drawn by the smell of sweat-soaked leather. Whether true or a cautionary tale, it reveals how even mundane acts like drying clothes could invite danger. Imagine waking barefoot in snow, footprints of wolves mocking you in the morning. Water also froze directly on bodies. If a cloak was damp at dusk, by midnight it might stiffen into a crust of ice. Some hunters deliberately shook garments every hour, rising from restless sleep just to keep them flexible. You can feel the stiff crackle in your hands, brittle folds snapping as you force a cloak back into shape. Survival meant vigilance not only against beasts but against rivers and streams. For all the perils of wolves and boars, it was often water clear, silent, and beautiful that claimed hunters first. You pull your cloak tighter, grateful it is only an imagined chill, and realize how fragile warmth was in those frozen forests. One slip into icy water could turn a night into a death sentence, no matter how strong your fire burned. Your cloak is finally dry, steam gone from the wool, but the night stretches long, and hunters of old often turned to nature's pharmacy for added comfort. Herbs, drinks, and little stimulants played a role in warding off both cold and fear. You can imagine a pouch at a hunter's belt not filled with arrows, but with leaves, berries, and roots remedies gathered as carefully as any weapon. Documents from medieval herbals reveal that mint, juniper, and thyme were considered warming plants. A sprig of mint chewed before sleep was thought to heat the chest and clear the breath. Juniper berries, when burned, released a sharp, resinous smoke that hunters believed kept lungs strong in frosty air. Thyme, boiled into broth, was credited with staving off chills. These weren't just imagined cures modern science notes, their oils do stimulate circulation and comfort, though far from perfect shields against cold. One curious tradition in Norse regions described hunters rubbing crushed juniper on their boots and hands, not only for warmth, but to mask their scent from wolves. It sounds eccentric, but the resin's strong odor may indeed have helped confuse animal noses. Whether practical or superstition, the practice reveals how plants wove into survival in ways both clever and strange. There is disagreement among scholars about how widely such herbal tricks spread. Some suggest they were well known thanks to monastic texts, since monks catalogued plants with great care. Others argue they were mostly folk knowledge, passed orally in villages, rarely written because peasants did not keep records. The evidence remains fragmented, a patchwork of recipes and rumors. The sensory world of these remedies is vivid. You can almost smell the sharp tang of juniper smoke curling into the night air, mingling with pine and wood fire. A hunter chews a sprig of mint, the cold air biting sharper through his nostrils, but the taste distracting from hunger and fatigue. A sip of mead follows, sweet and fiery, sending a rush of false warmth through the belly. For a few moments, the forest feels less hostile. Odd folk beliefs clung to these habits too. Garlic, for instance, was carried by some hunters as a charm against frost spirits, its pungent scent thought to repel not only illness but supernatural danger. In certain regions, dried rowan berries were strung as necklaces, both medicine and talisman. These details blur the line between treatment and magic, but in the uncertainty of the wilderness, every edge mattered. Picture yourself now crouched by the fire, chewing bitter leaves, smoke stinging your eyes, sipping from a horn of ale warmed at the edge of the coals. Your body is still cold, but your mind feels steadier. The rituals matter as much as the remedies. They give rhythm to the night, a sense that you are doing something, however small, to fight back. The cold presses at the edges of your shelter, relentless. Yet with herbs in your pouch, drink in your horn, and smoke rising sharp and clean, you sense what medieval hunters must have felt, that survival depended not just on furs and fire, but on the subtle comfort of plants, whispers of warmth growing in both body and spirit. The herbs ease your breath, but sleep still feels dangerous. Out here, warmth is fragile, and vigilance is everything. Medieval hunters knew that no single man could guard fire, food, and bodies through the entire night, so they divided the hours, taking turns to watch while the others rested. The rotation of night watches became as important to survival as cloaks or fire itself. Accounts of hunting parties and military scouts describe how groups set a rhythm for the dark hours. One man tended the flames and listened for movement, then nudged the next awake when his eyelids grew too heavy. Each shift was short, sometimes no longer than the burning of a log, so no one slipped too deeply into exhaustion. You can picture the weary hand reaching across to shake a companion's shoulder, a muttered curse, the reluctant stirring of limbs, and then a new guardian sitting up, spear across his knees. One odd custom survives in English folklore. Some huntsmen marked watches by burning sticks set upright in the ground. When the flame reached a certain knot in the wood, it was time to change. Primitive, yes, but reliable enough when no bells or clocks existed. The fire itself became the measure of time, its rhythm binding the group to wakefulness. There is debate among modern historians about whether these watches were strictly practical or carried ritual meaning as well. Some suggest they mirrored military discipline, strict and enforced. Others believe they were looser, guided more by instinct and trust among companions. Written evidence is scarce, and interpretations differ, but the result was the same. At least one pair of eyes always stayed open. The sensory details sharpen in your mind. Imagine lying half asleep, hearing the shuffle of boots as a comrade stands guard. The fire pops, his breath fogs in the dark, and you drift back into uneasy slumber knowing someone is listening. Later, you feel the tap on your foot, your turn. The cold bites hard as you sit up, cloak slipping from your shoulders, spear heavy in your hands. The others snore beside you, hounds curled at their sides. The forest is vast, but for a brief stretch of time, the duty of keeping them alive rests with you. Oddly enough, some regions developed superstitions about who should take which watch. The first was considered easiest, while the middle of the night was feared most, the dead watch, when spirits roamed freely and men's courage faltered. Hunters argued over drawing lots for this shift, some believing it cursed, others shrugging that fear was simply part of the job. You sit in the silence, ears straining, eyes darting at every flicker beyond the fire's glow. An owl hoots, a branch snaps. The night feels longer when you are the only one awake. Yet there is pride too, a sense of responsibility. You keep the embers alive, you keep wolves at bay, you ensure your companions breathe in warmth rather than frost. When at last you nudge the next man awake, your body trembling with fatigue, you know the cycle continues. Survival is not just individual, it is shared, divided, and passed along like the burning of a torch. And so, hunters endured the night not by facing it alone, but by breaking it into pieces, each man holding the darkness at bay for a little while. In this way, sleep and survival balanced, a fragile rhythm echoing through countless winters. The rhythm of watches carries the night forward, and sometimes fortune smiles. Instead of bedding down in the snow, hunters stumble upon a hut, lodge, or peasant cottage. These rare shelters transformed hardship into relief, turning what might have been a night of shivering into one of relative comfort. Imagine trudging through drifts, frost clinging to your beard, and then spotting smoke curling from a chimney, a promise of warmth and safety you hadn't dared to hope for. Records of royal hunts occasionally note such lodges scattered in vast forests. Built for gamekeepers or foresters, these cabins offered a hearth, a roof, and straw bedding. Nobles planned their expeditions around them, but even peasants knew the kindness of a stranger's fire. Travelers' accounts describe peasants reluctantly letting in hunters, sharing soup or bread, while muttering about scarce supplies. Hospitality was mixed with suspicion, yet the warmth inside made even strained silence feel like salvation. One curious detail appears in German hunting law. Fines were issued for damaging or dirtying foresters' huts, which suggests they were used frequently by wandering parties. Hunters valued these shelters enough to respect their rules, or at least to pay when they broke them. The huts themselves were simple, often just one room with a chimney hole, but to a man used to leaning against a tree in snow, they might as well have been castles. Historians remain divided on how common these encounters truly were. Some argue that forest lodges were abundant near royal reserves, while others believe they were scattered too thinly to matter for most hunts. Archaeological remains of hunting lodges support both views. Some forests reveal traces of buildings, others none. The debate reflects how unevenly comfort was distributed, depending on region and wealth. You can imagine stepping inside now. The air is thick with smoke and warmth, your frozen cloak steaming as you hang it near the fire. The straw mattress pricks at your skin, but you sink into it gratefully, every rustle better than cold ground. A wooden spoon scrapes against a pot as broth is ladled out, the smell rich with onions and fat. Hounds curl beneath the bench, finally sleeping soundly. An odd little superstition clings to these nights. Peasants sometimes warned guests not to whistle indoors, lest spirits be invited in to steal the warmth. Hunters obeyed, too weary to test such warnings. Whether true or not, it added a hush to the room, as though everyone feared breaking the fragile spell of comfort. For once, you let yourself breathe fully. The wind rattles outside, but it feels far away, muffled by wooden walls. Your fingers thaw, your eyelids droop. You know the morning will bring more trudging through snow, more hardship, but tonight you are not pressed against bark or huddled in a hollow. Tonight you have four walls and a hearth. For a medieval hunter, this was not luxury, it was heaven borrowed for a night. The warmth of a lodge or hut is rare, and more often the forest itself becomes your only companion. As hunters settled around their fires, stories rose with the smoke. Tales were not just amusement, they were warnings, reminders, and charms against the darkness. Among the most enduring were myths of winter beasts, spectral animals said to stalk men who slept carelessly in the snow. Medieval chronicles and folk ballads alike mention such creatures. Some spoke of the Schneegeist, a phantom stag that lured hunters deeper into the forest, only to vanish and leave them lost. Others feared the Nachtwolf, larger than any real wolf, whose eyes burned like coals and whose breath froze men where they stood. These were not simply bedtime stories. They were cultural reflections of real dangers becoming lost, facing wolves, surrendering to frost. A curious legend from Scandinavia describes the Fellkatten, a monstrous cat said to curl atop sleeping men, stealing their warmth until they never woke. To us, it sounds fanciful, yet it echoed a genuine habit of hunters fearing suffocation when sharing space with large hounds. Folklore often twisted practical worries into monstrous forms. Scholars remain uncertain how much weight hunters gave these tales. Some argue they were half-jokes, told to entertain and keep men awake during the dreaded middle watch. Others believe they were believed sincerely, shaping behavior as much as real wolves and bears. The truth is likely a blend, fear sharpened by story sharpened by fear. You can almost hear the firelit circle now. Men hunched in cloaks, steam curling from their mouths as one speaks in low tones. His voice rises and falls with the crackling of the flames, each pause punctuated by a howl in the distance. A companion mutters a charm under his breath. Another stares into the dark, imagining glowing eyes between the trees. The hounds shift uneasily, as if they too understand the words. One lesser-known belief tied to these stories was that certain animals could punish arrogance. If a hunter boasted too loudly about his skill, he might dream of a spectral boar or stag trampling him. Some men, waking in terror, swore the dream left bruises on their chests. Whether hallucination from exhaustion or superstition layered onto aches, the lesson was clear: humility was safer than pride. The sensory effect of these tales was profound. The fire's glow suddenly seemed smaller, the forest vaster. Each gust of wind rattled branches like footsteps. You feel it yourself, listening, as though unseen shapes pace just beyond the circle of light. The stories did not make men sleep better. They made them cautious, listening harder, clutching their spears tighter. Fear itself became a survival tool. And so, as you drift towards sleep again, your mind filled with images of phantom wolves and spectral stags, you realize that medieval hunters carried not only cloaks, furs, and fire into the wilderness. They carried their imagination, sharpening danger into legend. In a world where death waited silently behind trees, it was easier to face the night if you believed your fears had names. The fire dies low, the stories fade into silence, and you sense the larger truth. Hunting in winter was not only a personal struggle, but part of the rhythm of medieval society. People depended on meat even when the fields lay bare. Venison, boar, hare, these were foods expected at noble tables, regardless of season. And so, hunters ventured out in the harshest months, when cold tested every skill they had. Household records from noble estates confirm this demand. Kitchen accounts list venison served during January feasts, and chronicles describe lords insisting on winter hunts to display power. For peasants, the stakes were different. A successful snare or bowshot meant survival for families when grain was scarce. Winter hunting was dangerous, yes, but also necessary. Without it, bellies went empty. One curious fact is that some regions allowed otherwise forbidden hunting in winter, even for peasants. Forest laws, usually strict, sometimes relaxed when hunger pressed. A man caught poaching in summer might hang. Caught in midwinter, he might be fined or even ignored, as officials knew desperation drove him. The line between crime and survival blurred in the snow. Researchers still debate whether the risks outweighed the rewards. Some argue that winter hunting was inefficient. Energy lost often exceeded meat gained. Others point out that the fat of animals in colder months was prized and sustaining. Surviving records tilt both ways, leaving the question open: was it folly or necessity? Likely, it was both. The sensory experience of such hunts bleeds into the night. Imagine dragging a stag's carcass through snow, sweat soaking your tunic despite the cold. The meat freezes quickly, stiffening until it's like hauling stone. You and your companions must guard it, for wolves smell blood from miles away. Sleep that night is lighter than ever, one ear tuned to the snarls of unseen rivals. Odd beliefs also colored these hunts. In some villages, hunters left small offerings of bread or fat in the snow, thanking the forest for its gift. Failure to do so, people whispered, brought bad luck, missed shots, broken bows, nights colder than usual. Whether genuine devotion or habit born of fear, the ritual added weight to every kill. Now, as you rest in your imagined cloak, you reflect on how hunting was both duty and danger. Noble or peasant, all shared the same night, the same frost, the same fragile sleep in the wilderness. What differed was the reason: glory for some, survival for others. Yet the cold leveled them, teaching that in the forest, no title or wealth truly shielded a man from winter's bite. Dawn breaks pale and thin, and you wake stiff, your cloak frosted white at the edges. Medieval hunters often described mornings after winter sleep as battles in themselves, the struggle not only to rise, but to convince limbs to obey. Muscles cramped from cold nights ached with every motion. Fingers, stiff as sticks, refused to tie straps or grip bows until warmed slowly by friction and breath. Household chronicles mention hunts delayed because men could not move quickly at first light, their bodies sluggish, their joints creaking. This was not laziness. It was the aftermath of exposure. Sleep in the wilderness rarely refreshed it drained, leaving aches like invisible weights on the body. You can almost feel it now. The burning tingle as blood creeps back into numb toes, the pins and needles that make you wince before you can even stand. One unusual practice remembered in alpine villages was rubbing snow over stiff limbs to wake the body. It sounds counterintuitive, but the shock spurred circulation, bringing sensation back. Hunters swore it made them ready faster, though others cursed the pain of it. Was it common? Scholars remain uncertain, divided between those who see it as regional lore and those who think it a widespread habit lost to time. The sensory details are vivid. Your cloak crackles with frost as you shake it, sending a fine powder into the air. Pine boughs beneath you, once green, are brittle and brown, snapping when you rise. Your breath clouds heavily in the dawn chill, and every inhale feels sharp, like swallowing glass. Even the hounds stir reluctantly, shaking ice crystals from their fur with low groans. Odd folk sayings warned of frost sticking to the soul if you lingered too long in morning drowsiness. Hunters believed rising swiftly was essential, not only to chase prey but to keep life itself from slipping away. Whether superstition or simply encouragement, the saying shows how waking became an act of survival. You picture the scene clearly. Men stamping feet, clapping hands, blowing on fingers until smoke rises from breath and fire alike. Weapons are checked, meat hauled onto sledges or shoulders, and cloaks re-wrapped for another day's march. The night has passed, but its toll lingers. Medieval hunters did not wake refreshed. They woke sore, stiff, and grateful merely to have woken at all. And so you rise too, stretching against the brittle air, cloak heavy with frost but body still alive. The forest is silent, glittering in morning light. Survival through the night was not triumph. It was prelude. The hunt must go on, and another night will fall soon enough. You push yourself upright, every joint protesting, yet exhaustion lingers like a heavy chain. Medieval hunters often spoke of weariness as their fiercest adversary, greater even than wolves or frost. After days of trudging through snow, hauling game, and keeping watch through the night, fatigue seeped into every bone. And strangely, it was that very exhaustion that sometimes became their lullaby. Men too tired to care simply fell into sleep, no matter how cruel the conditions. Chronicles of military scouts mention soldiers collapsing mid-march, asleep in ditches with cloaks pulled tight. Hunters endured much the same. Some wrote of companions who slept standing, leaning on spears, too weary to build a fire or gather bedding. The body, pushed beyond its limits, surrendered even to the cold ground. You can picture it now, a hunter dropping where he stood, breath ragged, eyes closing as the forest groaned around him. One curious tale preserved in alpine folklore tells of men who dozed while walking, their companions nudging them awake before they wandered into streams or ravines. Was it true exhaustion or myth spun from fear of losing a friend? Scholars cannot agree, but the story reflects how fatigue haunted the medieval hunt as much as hunger or frost. Modern historians remain divided on whether exhaustion was more dangerous than cold itself. Some argue that sleepiness dulled survival instincts, making men careless with fire, weapons, or shelter. Others insist that without surrender to fatigue, the body would collapse entirely, and snatches of rest, however dangerous, were necessary. The truth is likely tangled between both views, much like the hunters themselves, swaying between survival and surrender. The sensory world of this weariness is harsh. Imagine eyelids drooping though snow stings your face, every blink threatening to last forever. Your body jerks awake when your knees buckle, but the relief is brief before drowsiness drags you again. Your ears still register the howls, the crack of branches, the whistle of wind, but they sound distant, muffled by the fog of exhaustion. Odd remedies arose to fight this pull. Some hunters chewed bitter roots, believing the sharp taste kept them alert. Others walked in circles, stamping feet until the ache replaced drowsiness. A few relied on their hounds, trusting a nudge or bark would wake them if danger approached. None of these tricks worked for long. The body always claimed its due. You sense it now, in your imagined cloak and boots, how irresistible that exhaustion becomes. The cold gnaws, but fatigue whispers, just close your eyes. And often, men did. Some woke stiff but alive, others did not wake at all. Fatigue, in the medieval wilderness, was both comfort and curse, a lullaby that could cradle you into survival or into silence. And so, as you lean back, eyelids drooping in your mind's eye, you realize why hunters both feared and depended on sleep. Exhaustion was the one companion they could not outrun, and in its arms, the line between life and death grew perilously thin. Exhaustion may have been universal, but not every hunter faced the wilderness equally. Wealth brought comforts that could soften even the harshest night. Nobles on great winter hunts often carried entire camps with them, tents, servants, feather bedding, and braziers to chase away the cold. To sleep beneath canvas with furs piled high was a world apart from the peasant who leaned against a tree. Estate records detail the equipment of noble hunting parties: woolen tents lined with skins, feather, stuffed mattresses, and even portable stoves fueled by charcoal. Chroniclers describe bright banners fluttering in snowy forests, as though the lords carried a fragment of their halls with them into the wilderness. Imagine the glow of lanterns inside a grand pavilion, the air smoky but warm, laughter rising as men reclined on cushions while hounds dozed in comfort at their feet. One strikingly odd account from Burgundy mentions noble hunters bringing entire beds on sledges, complete with carved wooden frames and curtains to hold in warmth. Was this exaggeration by a chronicler mocking their extravagance, or genuine excess? Scholars remain uncertain. Some argue it was symbolic, a display of wealth, while others believe such luxuries truly followed nobles into the forest. Meanwhile, researchers debate how effective these luxuries truly were. Featherbeds insulated well, but tents could collapse under snow, and charcoal braziers produced fumes that sickened or even suffocated men in enclosed spaces. Accounts of nobles retreating from hunts due to smoke or frost suggest that wealth did not always conquer nature. The comforts helped, but they were never guarantees. The sensory contrasts are vivid. Picture sinking into a feather mattress, cloaked in sable or marten fur, your body sighing with relief after hours in the cold. Outside, snow swirls silently. Wolves prowl. Peasants huddle against bark. Inside, you hear the crackle of a brazier, the shuffle of servants tending the fire, the low murmur of companions sipping spiced wine. The difference is stark, yet the forest presses at the walls all the same. Curious beliefs colored noble hunts too. Some lords insisted on sleeping beneath specific firs: lynx for sharp eyesight, bear for courage, fox for cunning, imagining the animal's qualities would seep into their dreams. Whether genuine faith or aristocratic fancy, it shows how symbolism and comfort mingled in their sleep. You realize that while wealth built walls against the cold, it did not erase the fundamental truth. The wilderness respected no rank. A collapsed tent, a snowstorm, or a restless wolf pack could strip away privilege in an instant. Still, for those who could afford it, a night in the forest might echo the halls of their estates rather than the hardships of their servants. And so you lie back in your imagined tent, the air warmer, the bedding softer, but the cold still whispering at the seams. Even nobles, swaddled in luxury, learned that nature never fully bowed to gold or silk. The forest tolerated comfort, but it never promised mercy. The noble tents may have glowed with warmth, but even those rich in furs and servants could not command the weather. When storms rolled in, comfort collapsed like canvas under heavy snow. Hunters of every rank, from peasants with nothing but cloaks to lords reclining on feather beds, discovered that the forest obeyed no man's will. Cold was the great equalizer, stripping away privilege and leaving all shivering alike. Chroniclers recount nights when entire expeditions faltered. A snowstorm sweeping across the Ardennes forced nobles to abandon hunts, their tents sagging and braziers sputtering out. Peasants caught in the same weather fared no better, huddling beneath branches, their meagre fires smothered. The record is clear. When winter struck in force, survival meant endurance, not wealth. One unusual anecdote comes from a Burgundian account of a grand hunt where silk pavilion walls froze stiff, crackling like parchment in the wind. Servants tried to knock snow from the roof, only for the canvas to split. The nobles fled to a nearby forester's hut, their velvet cloaks damp and their pride wounded. Whether embroidered by the writer to mock their masters or truly reported, it reveals how easily storms humbled even the mighty. Specialists still argue about the limits of luxury in the wilderness. Some believe noble hunts were so well provisioned they faced little risk, while others point to numerous records of sickness, frostbite, and failure among the wealthy. Comforts helped, but nature could overwhelm preparation. The evidence refuses to settle, much like the shifting winds that battered tents and cloaks alike. The sensory details of such storms are sharp. Imagine wind shrieking through pine trees, snow piling on roofs until canvas groans, fires sputter, smoke blows into eyes, and the air tastes of wet ash. Your cloak stiffens with ice, your bedding dampens, and every attempt to sleep is shattered by gusts rattling the shelter like a drum. Servants curse, dogs whine, men pull tighter together, realizing that even the best laid camp can become a trap. One curious belief tied to such storms was that loud laughter angered winter spirits. Hunters whispered that mocking the cold would provoke it, bringing blizzards down upon them. Whether or not anyone truly believed, silence often fell as the wind rose, as though no one dared tempt fate. Now you close your eyes inside that collapsing shelter, listening to ropes snap, poles creak, and snow hiss as it pours through gaps. The storm owns the night, and all you can do is endure, waiting for dawn to prove you stronger than the wind. Comfort is gone, but life remains if you cling tightly enough to what warmth still lingers. The storm has passed, leaving the forest ghostly and white. Hunters emerge stiff, cloaks frozen into boards, faces raw from wind. And yet, amid all this hardship, one thought often warmed them more than fire or fur: the memory of home. In the long, bitter nights, men spoke of hearths waiting in villages, of wives tending embers, of children curled in straw beds. It was not just warmth of flame they longed for, but the warmth of belonging. Estate letters and village chronicles hint at this yearning. Men absent for hunts wrote of dreaming of the hearth or of the bread their families baked. Even noble hunters, surrounded by attendants, spoke fondly of halls where tapestries muffled the chill and laughter filled the rafters. In the wilderness, the mind wandered back to those safer rooms, and the thought of returning kept spirits alive. One curious detail surfaces in folk songs. Hunters would sometimes sing softly to themselves, repeating refrains about firesides and loved ones. These songs doubled as lullabies, soothing weary minds into rest. Whether sung alone or in groups, the melodies reminded men that beyond the frozen trees life continued. You can almost hear a low tune now, wavering in the dark, carried on the smoke of a dwindling fire. Specialists disagree on whether this longing made hunters more reckless or more cautious. Some argue that thoughts of home pushed men to hurry, risking exhaustion to return quickly. Others claim the memories steadied them, encouraging patience and care, so they could truly see those hearths again. The sources do not settle the matter, leaving us to imagine each man balancing hope and haste in his own way. The sensory world of these memories is rich. Imagine lying on pine boughs, eyes half closed, but in your mind you are watching sparks from a hearth leap up into a chimney, smelling bread crisping on stone, hearing children laugh as they chase each other across a warm floor. For a moment, the biting air recedes, replaced by phantom comfort. Even your body seems to relax, as though memory itself lends warmth. Odd superstitions tied home directly to survival. Some hunters carried tokens from their households, pieces of cloth, small carvings, even a spoon from the family table, believing these objects guided them safely back. To lose such a token was thought unlucky, as if the thread to home had been cut. Whether genuine belief or sentimental habit, these keepsakes gave strength in the lonely dark. And so you lie there now, cloak stiff, body aching, yet your heart softened by thoughts of hearth and kin. The night is no shorter, the cold no weaker, but hope kindles within you. Perhaps that is why so many endured, not for the chase, not for the venison, but for the fire and faces waiting when the hunt was done. The forest lies quiet again, snow gleaming under the stars. You breathe out slowly, your cloak heavy, the fire dim, the dogs curled close. Nights like these tested everything a hunter carried: cloak, fur, fire, herbs, charms, and above all, endurance. To sleep without freezing was not just luck, it was the layering of knowledge, habit, and sheer stubbornness. Every choice, whether to dig a snow cave, huddle with companions, or wrap yourself in a hide, was a thread in the fragile weave between survival and silence. Well-attested chronicles describe how hunters passed these methods from father to son, apprenticeships in survival as much as in hunting itself. It wasn't enough to know how to track a deer, you had to know how to sleep afterward, or you might never rise to hunt again. Such traditions were the real inheritance of the forest, whispered by firelight rather than written in books. One odd tale remembered in village lore speaks of a hunter who, caught in a storm, wrapped himself in the carcass of a stag to live until dawn. Grim, yes, but such stories carried a lesson. Ingenuity, however desperate, kept breath flowing. Whether this was fact or fable, it embodies the spirit of survival, making shelter from whatever the wilderness offered. Experts remain divided on how much of what we know today reflects everyday practice versus exceptional tales. Were snow caves common or rare? Did every hunter carry herbs? Or only a few? The record is incomplete, a patchwork of chronicles, ballads, and folk memory. What is certain is that survival in the medieval forest required constant adaptation, and those who endured passed their tricks down through story and imitation. You feel it now in your imagination, the prickle of pine beneath you, the weight of fur, the closeness of hounds, the sting of smoke in your eyes, the echo of wolves beyond the fire. It is not comfort in any modern sense, but it is enough. Enough to let your body fall into shallow sleep, enough to keep the spark of life alive until the pale sun rises once more. And as you close your eyes in this long narrative, you realize the resilience of medieval hunters was not only in their skill with bow and spear, but in their ability to lie down in a frozen world and still wake to see the dawn. That, perhaps, was their greatest hunt of all. Now, let the story itself soften. The fire you have tended all night burns low, glowing red rather than blazing bright. Its light spreads gently, washing the snow in warm color, fading shadows into calm. Around you the hounds breathe steadily, their warmth familiar and reassuring. Companions stir but do not rise, wrapped in cloaks, faces peaceful at last. The storm has passed. The forest sighs, no longer hostile, but quiet, almost protective. You draw the cloak tighter around your shoulders, not in fear, but in comfort. The cold is still here, yet it feels gentler, more distant. The sharpness has dulled, replaced by a crisp stillness that soothes rather than bites. Above, stars gleam steadily, their light stretched thin across the sky. You gaze at them, eyelids heavy, knowing countless hunters before you looked up at the same glittering points, hoping for morning. Your body begins to ease, aches fading into the bed of pine beneath you. Every sound blends into one fire crackle, dog's breath, whisper of wind in branches. Each noise is steady, predictable, like a rhythm guiding you deeper into rest. You realize there is no more need to be watchful, not tonight. The danger has passed, if only for now. The forest becomes a cradle rather than a threat. Cold air wraps around you like a cool blanket, balancing the warmth trapped beneath your cloak. Your breath falls into slow, even patterns, syncing with the quiet around you. Eyes close fully, thoughts soften, and the edges of the world blur. So drift gently now, as the hunters once did, wrapped in the simplest of shelters, protected by warmth, by fire, by faith, and by each other. Sleep comes slowly, tenderly, and at last the wilderness feels like home. Sweet dreams.